At my wife's birthday party, my wife told her friends I was the family mistake. She laughed, pointed at me, and said, "Birth control's only 99% effective. He's the 1%. I left that night with $20 and a backpack. 6 years later, she finally found me. Today, she showed up crying at my door, begging me to talk. You know what they say about best-laid plans? Yeah, well, mine got steamrolled by a freight train of humiliation at 30,000 feet above sea level. And by sea level, I mean the rooftop restaurant where I was about to get publicly executed by the woman I married. Let me paint you a picture of how spectacularly this night was supposed to go. Sabrina's 32nd birthday, the big 3-2, as she'd been reminding everyone within a 50-mile radius for the past 2 months. I'm talking about the kind of birthday party that makes people question their life choices, the kind where you drop more cash than most people see in 3 months, all for one night of making memories. Because apparently, that's what love looks like when you're married to someone who thinks Pinterest is a legitimate life philosophy. I'd booked Skyline 42, this swanky rooftop joint downtown, where the appetizers cost more than my lunch budget for a week. Not just any table, mind you, the premium package. You know, the one that comes with the champagne tower that looks like something out of a rap video, complete with those fancy flutes that probably cost more individually than my entire wardrobe. I'd hired a string quartet because Sabrina mentioned once, that she thought live classical music was so sophisticated. These weren't just any musicians either. These were the kind of people who went to Juilliard and probably practiced scales while I was eating ramen for dinner. The guest list read like a who's who of people I couldn't stand but pretended to like for the sake of marital harmony. There was Jessica, the friend who somehow managed to turn every conversation into a humble brag about her yoga instructor boyfriend. There was Amanda, who insisted on calling every restaurant meal an experience and photographed her food more than most people photograph their kids. And then there was the crown jewel of this social disaster, Marcus, Sabrina's co-worker who had the emotional intelligence of a golden retriever and the subtlety of a foghorn when it came to flirting with my wife. But here's the thing about being the guy who pays for everything. You become invisible real quick. I'm standing there in my best shirt. Okay, my only decent shirt, watching everyone toast with champagne that I bought, eating food that I'm paying for, listening to music that's draining my savings account by the minute. And what am I? I'm the ghost at the feast, the wallet with legs, the human ATM machine who occasionally makes small talk about the weather. The evening started predictably enough. Everyone showed up fashionably late because apparently punctuality is for peasants. The champagne flowed. The conversation buzzed with the kind of mindless chatter that passes for sophistication when you're 3 drinks deep, and I stood around like a well-dressed piece of furniture, nodding at appropriate intervals and refilling glasses like some kind of unpaid bartender at my own financial funeral. I should have seen it coming. Hell, maybe I did see it coming and just chose to ignore the warning signs like some kind of emotional ostrich. Sabrina had been getting meaner lately, more cutting with her comments, more willing to throw me under the bus for a cheap laugh. But this was her birthday party, right? Surely she wouldn't choose tonight to completely obliterate what was left of my dignity. Wrong. So spectacularly, catastrophically wrong. It happened during the dessert course, some overpriced chocolate monstrosity that probably cost more than my car payment. The women had clustered together in that way women do when they're about to share something deliciously scandalous, their voices dropping to that conspiratorial whisper that somehow manages to carry across entire rooms. Cocktails were flowing, inhibitions were lowering, and apparently, my wife decided this was the perfect moment for some impromptu stand-up comedy. I was standing maybe 10 feet away, pretending to be fascinated by the city lights twinkling below us, when I heard it. That laugh. Sabrina's laugh, but sharper, more vicious than usual. It cut through the ambient noise like a knife through butter, and something in my gut twisted because I knew. I just knew. That laugh was about to ruin my life. Oh my God, you guys want to hear something hilarious? Sabrina's voice carried that particular tone that women use right before they're about to destroy someone's entire existence for entertainment purposes. So you know how birth control is supposed to be like 99% effective, right? The women leaned in closer, like vultures circling roadkill. Even Marcus, who had been hovering around the group like some kind of discount Romeo, perked up his ears. Well, Sabrina continued, and I could hear the smirk in her voice without even turning around. Turns out there's that pesky 1% failure rate that nobody talks about. She paused for dramatic effect, letting the anticipation build like some kind of twisted game show host. My bourbon suddenly tasted like sawdust, and my hands started shaking around the glass. Then she dropped the bomb. He's the 1%. She pointed directly at me, her perfectly manicured finger aimed at my chest like a weapon. My family mistake. The silence that followed lasted maybe half a second before the explosion of laughter hit. Not just giggles or chuckles. We're talking full-blown, doubled over, tears streaming down faces hysteria. Jessica snorted champagne through her nose. Amanda literally slapped her knee. Even Marcus, that spineless sycophant, let out a belly laugh that probably could be heard 3 blocks away. But the worst part? The absolute worst part was watching Sabrina bask in it. She stood there soaking up the laughter like some kind of comedy genius, her eyes bright with the satisfaction of a perfectly landed punchline. She'd just called me, her husband, the man who'd just dropped a small fortune on her birthday celebration, a mistake. Not just any mistake, but a family mistake, like I was some kind of genetic accident that had somehow wormed its way into her life. I stood there, frozen, while the laughter echoed around me. My face felt like it was on fire, my chest tight with something between rage and absolute humiliation. Every person at that party, people I'd fed, people I'd entertained, people I'd tried so damn hard to impress, was laughing at me. At us. At the pathetic joke that was my marriage. The smart thing would have been to confront her right there. To stand up for myself, to demand an apology, to make a scene worthy of the money I'd just blown. Instead, I did what I always did. I swallowed it. I forced my face into something resembling a smile, raised my glass in a mock toast, and pretended like my wife hadn't just publicly announced that my existence was an accident she regretted. The rest of the evening passed in a blur of fake smiles and forced conversation. I made excuses about checking on the bill, about getting some air, about anything that would get me away from the group of people who now saw me as the punchline to my wife's favorite joke. When dessert was finished and the last of the champagne was gone, I helped clean up, tipped the staff way too much because I felt sorry for anyone who had to witness that train wreck, and walked everyone to the elevators like nothing had happened. Sabrina was still buzzing from the party, chattering away about how much fun everyone had, how perfect everything was, completely oblivious to the fact that she'd just nuked our marriage from orbit. Or maybe she wasn't oblivious. Maybe she just didn't care. "That was amazing, babe," she said as we waited for our ride. Everyone loved it. Did you see how hard they laughed at that birth control joke? I'm totally using that again. And that's when something inside me clicked off. Not broke. Clicked off, like someone had flipped a switch and suddenly all the lights went out. I looked at her standing there, still glowing from her moment of triumph, and realized that I was married to someone who thought my pain was entertainment. I didn't say anything during the ride home. I didn't say anything as we walked up to our apartment. I didn't say anything as she headed to the bathroom to start her elaborate skincare routine, still giggling about her brilliant joke. I just stood there in our bedroom, looking around at the life we'd built together, and realized it had all been built on quicksand. When I heard the shower start, I moved fast. I grabbed my old backpack from the closet, the one from college that had seen better decades, and started stuffing it with the essentials. 2 shirts, a pair of jeans, underwear, socks, my toothbrush, and the $20 bill I kept in my wallet for emergencies. That was it. That was the sum total of what I could call mine in a life I'd been paying for. No note. No dramatic confrontation. No grand exit speech. I just slung that backpack over my shoulder, took one last look at the apartment where I'd been slowly dying for the past 3 years, and walked out. I closed the door quietly behind me, like I was just running to the store for milk, and stepped out into the night. The city streets stretched out before me, endless and dark and full of possibility. For the first time in years, I had no idea where I was going or what I was going to do next. But you know what? It felt like freedom. It felt like the first real breath I'd taken in months. Sabrina had called me a mistake, and maybe she was right. But as I walked away from that life, that marriage, that version of myself that had been slowly suffocating under the weight of other people's expectations, I made myself a promise. If I was going to be a mistake, I was going to be the kind of mistake that people remembered. The kind that came back to haunt them. You ever try to sleep on a bench designed by someone who clearly hated the human spine? Because let me tell you, the fine folks at the Metropolitan Transit Authority apparently graduated from the same school of furniture design as medieval torture enthusiasts. That first night, curled up in the downtown bus station with my backpack as a pillow and my jacket as a blanket, I discovered muscles in my back I didn't even know existed. And they were all filing formal complaints. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead like angry wasps, flickering just enough to make you question your sanity, but not enough to actually go out and give you some peace. Every 20 minutes, another bus would wheeze into the station, disgorging a collection of night shift workers, insomniacs, and people who looked like they'd made some equally spectacular life choices. The smell was this delightful cocktail of industrial disinfectant, stale coffee, and that particular ode to humanity you only encounter in places where hope goes to die. But here's the thing about rock bottom. It's got a weird kind of clarity to it. Lying there on that bench, listening to some guy 3 seats over practicing what I can only assume was his audition for America's Got Talent. Spoiler alert. He wasn't going to make it. I felt something I hadn't experienced in years. Relief. Pure, unadulterated relief. Nobody was going to use me as a punchline tonight. Nobody was going to look at me and see a walking credit card with abandonment issues. For the first time in God knows how long, I was completely, utterly alone with my thoughts. And my thoughts, it turned out, were pissed. The security guard, a heavy-set guy whose name tag read Earl in faded letters, made his rounds every hour like clockwork. Earl had the look of someone who'd seen everything twice and wasn't impressed either time. Around 3 a.m., he stopped by my bench and gave me the kind of once-over that cops and bounders perfect, the assessment that determines whether you're trouble or just pathetic. "You waiting for a bus, son?" he asked, his voice carrying that particular brand of tired authority that comes from dealing with society's leftovers for minimum wage. Yeah, I lied, because the truth, that I was a 30-year-old man who'd just torched his entire life over a birthday party joke, seemed too complicated for 3 a.m. conversation. Earl nodded like he'd heard that lie 1,000 times before. "Bus to where?" "Anywhere but here," I said, which was probably the first honest thing I'd said all night. He chuckled at that, a dry sound that might have been sympathy or just recognition of a fellow traveler on the highway to nowhere. "Fair enough. Just keep it quiet, and we won't have any problems." The second night, I graduated to sleeping under the Morrison Street Bridge. If you've never had the pleasure of urban camping, let me paint you a picture. The acoustics under a bridge are absolutely fantastic. Every car that passes overhead sounds like Zeus having a temper tantrum. The concrete's got all the warmth and comfort of a morgue slab, and the morning dew has this charming way of soaking through whatever pathetic barrier you've managed to construct between yourself and hypothermia. But I wasn't alone under there. Apparently, bridge real estate was prime territory in the homeless community, and I was the new kid trying to figure out the social dynamics of survival. There was Marcus, a Vietnam vet who'd been living rough for so long he'd forgotten what year it was. There was Jennifer, a woman maybe my age who talked to herself in 3 different voices and seemed to be having some pretty heated arguments with her invisible companions. And there was Dog. Nobody knew his real name, but he traveled with this mangy German Shepherd mix who was probably the smartest member of our little community. They taught me the basics: where to find clean water, which dumpsters had the best leftover food, how to stay invisible when the cops made their sweeps. More importantly, they taught me that being homeless wasn't just about not having a roof. It was about becoming part of an entirely different ecosystem, one with its own rules and hierarchies and survival strategies. The trick, Marcus told me on that second night, sharing a can of beans he'd warmed over a makeshift fire, is not to let it get into your soul. Soon as you start thinking this is who you are instead of just where you are, you're done. Hunger, I discovered, is a lot like that annoying friend who won't take a hint and leave the party. At first, it's just mildly uncomfortable, a gentle reminder that, hey, maybe you should grab a sandwich. Then it becomes more insistent, like a toddler tugging at your sleeve, demanding attention. By day 3, it's a full-blown obsession, a constant companion that colors every thought and decision. Your stomach stops growling and starts staging full-scale protests, complete with sound effects that could probably be heard from space. That's how I found myself lurking outside Mel's all-night diner at 6 a.m. on day 4. watching through the windows as the morning crowd wolfed down plates of eggs and bacon and hash browns that might as well have been caviar and champagne for how desperately I wanted them. The smell of coffee and grease drifting through the door every time someone entered was pure torture, like being trapped in some kind of culinary purgatory. I'd been standing there for maybe 20 minutes, trying to work up the courage to go inside and beg for scraps like some kind of Victorian orphan, when I saw my opportunity. A businessman in an expensive suit had ordered way too much food, probably stress eating over some corporate crisis that would seem laughably trivial to anyone sleeping under a bridge. He'd barely touched his toast, left half his eggs, and walked out talking loudly into his phone about quarterly projections. The waitress, a middle-aged woman with tired eyes and comfortable shoes, started clearing his table. Without thinking, I slipped inside and casually reached for the abandoned toast like I belonged there. Like I was just another customer making a reasonable breakfast decision. "Excuse me, honey." The voice behind me had the kind of authority that stops you mid-motion. I turned around to find myself face-to-face with the waitress, whose name tag identified her as Gloria. She was looking at me with the expression of someone who'd caught countless people doing exactly what I was doing. "That's not your table." My face went nuclear red. Here I was, a grown man getting busted for trying to steal leftover toast. If Sabrina could see me now, she'd have material for jokes for the rest of her life. I'm sorry, When's the last time you ate?" Gloria asked, cutting through my stammering with surprising gentleness. "Yesterday," I lied. It had actually been 2 days, but admitting that felt like crossing some kind of line I wasn't ready to cross. Gloria studied me for a moment, taking in the wrinkled clothes, the desperate look in my eyes, the general aura of a man who'd made some spectacular life choices. Then she sighed, the kind of sigh that carries the weight of too much experience with human suffering. "You know how to wash dishes?" she asked. I blinked. "What? Dishes? Can you wash them without breaking them?" Yes." "Good. Kitchen's through that door. Miguel will show you what to do. You work a full shift, you get a meal and $20 cash. You show up on time and don't steal anything. Maybe we can make it regular." And just like that, I went from street vagrant to gainfully employed. Well, employed might be a strong word. More like temporarily useful to society in exchange for food and pocket change. But it was something. It was a foothold, a tiny crack in the wall of circumstances that had been crushing me. The dish pit at Mel's was exactly as glamorous as it sounds. Picture a constantly steaming cave filled with the detritus of other people's meals, where you spend 8 hours up to your elbows in water hot enough to cook lobster, scrubbing plates that have seen things no plate should ever see. My hands, soft from years of desk work and marriage to someone who considered manual labor beneath her social status, turned into raw hamburger within the first hour. But you know what? It felt good. Not the dishwashing part. That was pure misery, but the earning part. For the first time in years, I was getting paid for something I was actually doing, not just for existing as someone's husband or ATM machine. Every plate I cleaned, every pot I scrubbed, every glass I dried was mine. My work, my effort, my sweat. At the end of that first shift, Gloria handed me a plate piled high with meatloaf, mashed potatoes, and green beans, plus a $20 bill that felt like winning the lottery. I ate that meal slowly, savoring every bite not just because I was starving, but because I'd earned it. Nobody had given it to me out of pity or obligation, or because they were trying to impress someone else. I'd worked for it. That night, I found a 24-hour laundromat with decent Wi-Fi and nursed a cup of coffee that cost more than I probably should have spent, but felt like a luxury beyond measure. I sat there in a plastic chair that was somehow more comfortable than any piece of furniture in the apartment I'd shared with Sabrina, and for the first time since walking out of that birthday party, I started planning instead of just surviving. Sabrina's words were still echoing in my head. Family mistake. But something had shifted. Instead of breaking me down, they were building something up. Something hard and determined and absolutely fucking furious. She thought I was a mistake? Fine. But I'd be the kind of mistake that haunted her dreams, the kind that made her question every decision she'd ever made. I pulled out my phone and started making notes. Not a grand plan, nothing dramatic, just small, concrete steps. Find a place to shower. Keep the dishwashing job. Start saving money. Figure out what comes next. Baby steps toward becoming the kind of person who'd never let anyone use them as a punchline again. The city hummed around me through the laundromat windows, full of people heading home to warm beds and loving families and lives that made sense. I wasn't there yet. I was sitting in a laundromat at midnight with 20 bucks to my name and dishwater under my fingernails, making plans on the back of a napkin. But for the first time in years, those plans were mine. You know how they say you can get used to anything? Well, turns out that's both a blessing and a curse when anything includes sleeping in the back room of a diner that smells like a combination of bacon grease and industrial-strength floor cleaner. After 2 weeks of crashing on Gloria's ancient pull-out couch in the break room, which had all the structural integrity of a paper airplane and made sounds like a dying moose every time I shifted position, I developed a Pavlovian response to the coffee machine. Every time it gurgled to life at 4 a.m., my body would automatically assume it was time to start another day of dishwater hell. But hey, beats sleeping under a bridge, right? That's what I kept telling myself as I folded my 6-foot frame into what had clearly been designed for someone the size of a garden gnome. The break room had become my entire world. A windowless box with flickering fluorescent lights, motivational posters that had seen better decades, and a refrigerator that hummed threats in a language I was pretty sure wasn't covered by any warranty. Gloria, bless her caffeinated heart, had basically adopted me like some kind of stray cat she found behind the dumpster. Which, let's be honest, wasn't that far from the truth. She'd leave leftover pie on the counter with a note that said for the dishwasher, like she was being sneaky about it. She'd, accidentally, make too much coffee and insist I help her finish it. And every morning, she'd ask how I slept with the kind of concern usually reserved for sick relatives. Even though we both knew the answer was, like garbage, thanks for asking. The diner had its own ecosystem of regulars, and after 2 weeks, I was starting to recognize the patterns. There was Frank, the cab driver who came in every day at 3 a.m. for black coffee and complained about everything from the weather to the government to the general state of human civilization. There was Dolores, who worked the night shift at the hospital and had perfected the art of eating a full breakfast in under 5 minutes. And then there was Ralph. Ralph was different from the usual crowd. For starters, he came in around midnight, which put him in that weird twilight zone between the dinner rush and the breakfast crowd. He was maybe 55, built like someone who'd spent his life doing actual work instead of just talking about it, with hands that looked like they could crush walnuts and a face that had seen some weather. He always ordered the same thing, black coffee, apple pie if Gloria had made it fresh, and he always sat at the counter where he could watch the kitchen. What made Ralph interesting wasn't what he ordered or where he sat. It was how he watched. This guy had the observation skills of a detective and the patience of a monk. He'd sit there nursing his coffee, occasionally making small talk with Gloria about the weather or the baseball scores, but his eyes were always moving, watching, assessing, and for the past week, those eyes had been spending a lot of time focused on me. I'd catch him looking sometimes when I was wrestling with a particularly stubborn pot, or when Gloria would slip me an extra sandwich. Not in a creepy way, more like he was trying to figure out a puzzle. It was the kind of attention that made you simultaneously paranoid and curious, like when you know someone's talking about you, but you can't tell if it's good or bad. The night everything changed started like any other. I'd worked a double shift because one of the other dishwashers had called in sick, translation, hungover, and by the time we closed at 2 a.m., I was running on pure caffeine and spite. My hands looked like I'd been wrestling with angry lobsters. My back felt like I'd been carrying a piano up Mount Everest, and I was pretty sure I'd absorbed enough grease through my pores to qualify as a petroleum product. Gloria had locked up and headed home to whatever normal life normal people lived, leaving me alone in the break room with my fold-out torture device and a leftover piece of chocolate cake that was probably worth more than my hourly wage. I'd just managed to get horizontal without causing a complete structural collapse when I heard the knock. Not on the front door. On the back door that led to the alley where we kept the dumpsters and where I'd first learned that restaurant garbage was surprisingly competitive territory among the city's wildlife. It was a firm, confident knock that somehow managed to sound both polite and insistent. My first thought was that it was probably some drunk looking for a bathroom or maybe someone trying to break in, because let's face it, my luck had been running pretty consistently toward the completely screwed end of the spectrum lately. But something about the rhythm of the knock made me think twice. It was too measured, too respectful to be random trouble. I cracked open the door and found myself face to face with Ralph, holding 2 cups of coffee from the 7-Eleven down the street and looking like he'd been expecting me to answer. "Evening," he said, like showing up at a closed diner's back door at 2:30 a.m. was the most natural thing in the world. "Mind if I come in? We need to talk." Now, in normal circumstances, letting a relative stranger into your temporary home in the middle of the night would rank somewhere between questionable judgment and potential Darwin Award winner. But these weren't normal circumstances, and Ralph didn't feel like a stranger. Plus, he'd brought coffee, which in my current caffeine-dependent state was basically a peace offering. "Sure," I said, stepping aside to let him in. "Welcome to my palace." Ralph looked around the break room with the eye of someone who'd seen his share of less-than-ideal living situations. He didn't make a big deal about the fold-out couch or the fact that I was clearly camping out in a commercial kitchen. He just nodded like he was mentally cataloging the situation and handed me one of the coffees. "Thanks," I said, accepting the cup like it was a lifeline. "So what's this about? Because if you're here to rob me, I should probably mention that my entire net worth is about $12 and some lit." Ralph chuckled at that, a sound that had some genuine warmth in it. "Not here to rob you, son. I'm here because I've been watching you for the past couple weeks, and I've got some questions." "Okay, that doesn't sound ominous at all." "Nothing sinister," he assured me, settling into one of the plastic chairs like he had all the time in the world. "I'm just curious about what a guy who's clearly not from the streets is doing sleeping in a diner break room and washing dishes for Gloria." I took a long sip of coffee and considered my options. I could lie, spin some story about temporary setbacks or family emergencies. I could deflect with humor or change the subject entirely. Or I could do something I hadn't done since walking out of Sabrina's birthday party. Tell the truth. "My wife called me a mistake in front of all her friends," I said finally. "So I left." Ralph nodded like that explained everything, which was both refreshing and slightly concerning. "Family mistake, huh? That's a hell of a thing to say to someone." "Yeah, well, she had a real gift for cutting remarks." The words came out more bitter than I'd intended, but Ralph didn't seem bothered by the edge in my voice. "So you walked away with nothing and ended up here." "Pretty much. Although technically I had $20 in a backpack, so I wasn't completely destitute. And now you're what? Planning to wash dishes for the rest of your life?" That question hit me harder than I expected, because the honest answer was that I didn't know what I was planning. I'd been so focused on surviving day to day, on not starving or freezing, that I hadn't really thought beyond the immediate crisis. I was stuck in survival mode, treading water in a sea of dirty dishes and leftover dreams. "I don't know," I admitted. "Haven't really thought that far ahead." Ralph studied me over his coffee cup, and I got the feeling I was being evaluated for something. "You know what I do for a living?" "Not really. You come in here every night, you tip well, and you don't cause trouble. Beyond that, you're a mystery. Construction, renovation work, mostly. Been doing it for 30 years, got my own crew, specialize in taking places that are falling apart and making them worth something again." He paused, letting that sink in. "It's good work. Honest work. And it pays better than washing dishes." I felt something stir in my chest. Hope, maybe, or just the possibility of hope. "Are you offering me a job?" "I'm offering you a chance to prove you want one. Weekend work first, cash under the table while you learn the basics. You show up on time, work hard, and don't screw around. Maybe we make it permanent." "I don't know anything about construction." "I didn't figure you did. But you know what? I can teach someone how to swing a hammer or read a tape measure. What I can't teach is work ethic, and from what I've seen, you've got that covered. Question is, you ready to do something harder than feeling sorry for yourself?" That stung, but it was supposed to. Ralph wasn't offering me charity or pity. He was offering me a chance to earn something better. The difference was important. "When do we start?" I asked. "Saturday morning, 7 a.m. There's a duplex on Elm Street that needs gutting before we can make it livable again. Hope you don't mind getting dirty." I looked around the break room, at the fold-out couch that was slowly destroying my spine, at the motivational posters promising that teamwork makes the dream work, at the life I'd been cobbling together from scraps and stubbornness. "Dirtier than this?" Ralph grinned, the first genuine smile I'd seen from him. "Son, you have no idea." After he left, I sat there in the break room with my lukewarm coffee, staring at the back door like Ralph might materialize again with more life-changing propositions. For the first time since walking out of my old life, I felt something other than anger or desperation. I felt possibility. Sabrina had called me a mistake, and maybe in the context of her perfect little world, I was. But sitting there in that break room, thinking about swinging hammers and learning something new, I started to wonder if maybe being her mistake was the best thing that had ever happened to me. Saturday was 3 days away. 3 days to keep washing dishes, sleeping on a couch that predated the moon landing, and dreaming about what it might feel like to build something instead of just surviving. For the first time in weeks, I went to sleep excited about waking up. Turns out, when Ralph said I had no idea how dirty construction work could get, he wasn't just being dramatic. He was being optimistic. By 9 a.m. on that first Saturday, I looked like I'd been wrestling with a demolition derby in a coal mine. My hands, which had finally started recovering from dishwater abuse, were now acquiring an entirely new collection of cuts, scrapes, and what I'm pretty sure were permanent paint stains. My back, which had been complaining about the fold-out couch, was now filing formal grievances with the United Nations. But here's the weird thing. I loved every miserable, back-breaking minute of it. The duplex on Elm Street was what real estate agents would generously call a fixer-upper, and what normal people would call condemned property waiting to happen. The previous tenants had apparently been operating under the theory that walls were optional and that plumbing was more of a suggestion than a necessity. The kitchen looked like someone had detonated a grease bomb. The bathroom had developed its own ecosystem, and I'm pretty sure the living room carpet had achieved sentience and was plotting revenge. Ralph's crew was a motley collection of guys who looked like they'd been assembled by someone with a sense of humor and a deep appreciation for irony. There was Tommy, a kid maybe 22 who could hang drywall with the precision of a Swiss watchmaker but couldn't tie his shoes without supervision. There was Big Jim, who lived up to his name in every dimension and had the kind of gentle demeanor that made you forget he could probably bench press a compact car. And there was Santos, who spoke 3 languages fluently and could fix literally anything with duct tape, prayer, and what I suspect was actual magic. New guy. Ralph hollered over the sound of Santos attacking a wall with what looked like medieval siege equipment. Grab that sledgehammer and start making yourself useful. Now, I'd never swung a sledgehammer before, but how hard could it be, right? It's a big hammer. You swing it at things. Physics does the rest. What could possibly go wrong? Everything. Everything could go wrong. My first swing was so pathetically weak that the drywall basically laughed at me. My second swing was so enthusiastically off-target that I nearly took out a load-bearing beam. My third swing connected perfectly with the wall, sending a shock wave up my arms that I felt in my teeth, and creating a hole roughly the size of a dinner plate. "Well," said Big Jim, inspecting my handiwork with the kind of diplomatic expression you'd use to critique a toddler's finger painting. "That's enthusiastic." "Give him time," Ralph said, though I caught him shaking his head when he thought I wasn't looking. Everyone's got to start somewhere. By lunch, I'd managed to demolish about 6 square feet of wall without causing any structural damage or requiring medical attention, which Ralph declared not terrible for a first-timer. The crew shared their sandwiches and thermos coffee with me like I was already part of the family, telling stories about jobs gone wrong, contractors who tried to stiff them, and the time Big Jim accidentally put a hammer through someone's water main. The trick, Tommy explained through a mouthful of bologna sandwich, is to let the tool do the work. You're not trying to muscle through everything. You're just guiding the process. It was good advice for demolition. It was even better advice for life. The first few months blurred together in a haze of 12-hour days and muscles I'd forgotten existed. Monday through Friday, I was still washing dishes at Gloria's, earning just enough to cover basic expenses and save a few dollars here and there. Weekends belonged to Ralph's crew, where I was slowly learning that construction was as much about problem-solving as it was about physical labor. Every job was a puzzle. How do you install a window in a wall that's not quite square? How do you run electrical through a house that was apparently wired by someone who'd learned about electricity from comic books? How do you make a bathroom functional when the previous owner had installed the toilet in what could generously be called an artistic location? Ralph turned out to be the kind of teacher who believed in learning by doing, which meant I spent those early weeks making every possible mistake at least twice. I put drywall screws through pipes. I wired light switches that somehow controlled outlets in completely different rooms. I measured twice and cut wrong so many times that Tommy started betting on whether my boards would be too long or too short. But slowly, so slowly I almost didn't notice it happening, I started getting better. My hands developed calluses that could handle rough lumber without complaint. My eye learned to spot when something was level without needing to check the bubble. My back adapted to the constant lifting and carrying and crawling through spaces that were clearly designed for much smaller humans. More importantly, I was learning to think differently. In my old life, problems were things that happened to you. Inconveniences that required calling professionals or throwing money at them until they went away. In construction, problems were just part of the process. The pipe doesn't fit? Figure out how to make it fit. The measurements don't match the plans? Adapt and overcome. The whole project is taking twice as long as expected? Welcome to construction, buddy. Grab a coffee and get back to work. By the end of my first year, Ralph offered me full-time work. Not just weekends anymore. Real work, with regular hours and something resembling actual pay. It meant giving up the dishwashing gig at Gloria's, which felt like leaving family. Gloria cried when I told her, then immediately started planning a going-away party that involved way too much cake and several speeches about how proud she was of her boy. With steady income finally coming in, I was able to move out of the diner's break room and into my own place. A studio apartment that made the break room look spacious but had the distinct advantage of being mine. The landlord, a guy named Pete who looked like he'd given up on life sometime around the Clinton administration, showed me around the place with all the enthusiasm of someone conducting a funeral. Hot water works most of the time, he explained, jiggling the bathroom faucet. Heat's included, but don't get crazy with it. Neighbors are quiet, mostly because half of them are probably dead. Rent's due on the 1st, late fees start on the 2nd, and if you're more than a week behind, you're out. It was perfect. Okay, not actually perfect. The ceiling had a stain that looked suspiciously like a map of South America. The kitchen was so small you had to step into the hallway to change your mind, and I'm pretty sure something was living in the walls. But it was mine. For walls, a door that locked, and nobody could kick me out as long as I paid the rent on time. I furnished the place gradually, mostly with stuff I found on job sites or bought secondhand from people who were upgrading their lives. A mattress from a guy who was getting married and whose fiancée had standards. A table from a house we were renovating where the owners just wanted everything gone. A chair that I'm pretty sure had been rescued from a curb somewhere, but was still more comfortable than anything I'd owned in years. The best part about having my own place wasn't the space or the privacy. It was the silence. No more falling asleep to the sounds of the diner's night shift. No more waking up to coffee machines and early morning deliveries. Just quiet, blessed quiet, where I could think and plan and slowly figure out who I was becoming. Because that's what was happening, whether I'd planned it or not. The guy who'd walked out of Sabrina's birthday party was disappearing, replaced by someone harder and more practical and infinitely more self-reliant. This new version of me could fix a leaky faucet without calling a plumber, could look at a room and estimate how much paint it would need, could earn a living with his hands instead of just shuffling papers and hoping for the best. I started taking business classes online, hunched over a second-hand laptop that Ralph's nephew was getting rid of. The screen flickered and the battery lasted about 15 minutes, but it connected to the internet, and that was all I needed. I learned about budgeting and cash flow and the difference between revenue and profit. I studied at night after work, too tired to absorb much, but too stubborn to quit. Every Aeon and assignment felt like a small victory against the version of myself who'd accepted being called a mistake. Every project I completed without screwing up major was proof that maybe I wasn't as hopeless as Sabrina had made me feel. Every dollar I managed to save was a brick in the wall I was building between my old life and whatever came next. The work was hard, the hours were long, and my social life consisted mainly of hanging out with guys who considered beer and baseball the height of intellectual discourse. But for the first time in my adult life, I was earning respect instead of just demanding it. I was building something. Not just walls and floors and functional plumbing, but a version of myself that nobody could tear down with a well-timed joke. Sabrina had called me a family mistake, and maybe she was right. But as I sat in my tiny apartment on Sunday evenings, planning the week ahead and counting the money I'd saved, I realized that being her mistake might have been the best thing that ever happened to me. The man who'd paid for champagne towers and string quartets was gone. In his place was someone who knew the difference between load-bearing walls and decorative ones, who could make a dollar stretch until it screamed, and who was slowly, methodically, building a life that nobody could take away from him. It wasn't the life I'd planned, but it was mine. And for the first time in years, that felt like enough. You know what nobody tells you about starting over? It's not just about rebuilding your life. It's about rebuilding your entire social ecosystem from scratch. When you walk away from a marriage, you don't just lose your spouse. You lose their friends, their family, their entire network of people who used to pretend they liked you. Suddenly you're like some kind of social hermit crab, wandering around looking for a new shell to call home. For the first couple years after leaving Sabrina's birthday party disaster, my social circle consisted mainly of Ralph's crew and the cast of characters at Gloria's Diner. Don't get me wrong. These were good people, solid people, the kind who'd give you the shirt off their back if you needed it. But hanging out with them was like being the weird cousin at a family reunion. They accepted me, sure, but I was still clearly the outsider trying to figure out where I fit. The breakthrough came from the most unlikely source. Diego Martinez, a guy on Ralph's crew who looked like he could bench press a Buick but had the financial acumen of a Wall Street shark. We'd been working together for about 6 months when I mentioned that I was trying to build up my credit score from whatever crater Sabrina had probably left it in. Dude, Diego said, pausing in the middle of installing kitchen cabinets. You're doing it all wrong. Doing what wrong? Everything. Credit cards, savings, the whole financial game. You're playing like someone who's never heard the rules. Diego, it turned out, had grown up in a family where financial literacy was a survival skill, not a luxury. His parents had immigrated from Mexico with basically nothing and had built a small empire of rental properties through what he called aggressive budgeting and strategic debt management. He'd been watching me stumble through basic money management like someone trying to perform surgery with a butter knife. Look, he said during our lunch break, pulling out his phone and showing me a spreadsheet that looked like it could calculate the trajectory of space missions. Credit cards aren't evil. They're tools. Use them right. They help you build credit and earn rewards. Use them wrong. They'll bury you so deep you'll need archaeological equipment to dig out. He spent the next hour explaining concepts that should have been obvious but somehow weren't. How credit utilization worked, why paying off the full balance mattered, the difference between good debt and bad debt. It was like getting a crash course in adulting from someone who actually knew what they were talking about. Here's what you're going to do, Diego said, writing numbers on a napkin. Get a secured credit card, put one recurring bill on it, something small like Netflix or your phone, and set up automatic payments. Use it for nothing else. In 6 months, your score will start climbing. That's it. That's the beginning. Building credit is like building muscle. You start small and consistent, then gradually increase the weight. Diego became my unofficial financial advisor, texting me articles about investing, sending me links to budgeting apps, and occasionally stopping by my apartment to make sure I wasn't doing anything spectacularly stupid with my money. He had this way of explaining complex concepts in terms a construction worker could understand, which was exactly what I needed. Then there was Mrs. Hill, my upstairs neighbor who somehow managed to be both the nosiest and most caring person I'd ever met. She was maybe 70, built like a sparrow but with the personality of a hawk, and she had apparently appointed herself as the unofficial den mother of our building. Within a week of moving in, she knew my work schedule, my favorite coffee brand, and probably my social security number. "You're too thin," was the first thing she ever said to me, appearing in the hallway like some kind of maternal ninja while I was struggling to get my key to work in a lock that clearly had trust issues. "And you cough too much. You getting sick? Just tired from work?" I said, finally managing to get the door open. She gave me the kind of once-over that mothers and grandmothers have perfected over millennia. "I'm making extra soup tomorrow. I'll leave some by your door." And she did. Constantly. Casseroles when she heard me coughing, soup when the weather turned cold, cookies when she decided I looked too serious. She never asked for anything in return, never made a big deal about it. She'd just leave food outside my door with little notes like, "Eat this before it goes bad," or "You need vegetables in your diet." Mrs. Hill became my early warning system for everything from rent increases to neighborhood drama. She knew which apartments were about to become available, which landlords in the area were decent, and which grocery stores had the best deals. More importantly, She treated me like family in a way that had nothing to do with obligation or pity. She was just genuinely concerned about my well-being because that's who she was. But the person who really changed everything was Lydia Chun, and I met her in the most millennial way possible, arguing about spreadsheets in an online finance forum. It started with a post I'd made asking for advice about budgeting for irregular income. Construction work could be feast or famine depending on the season and the local economy. I'd gotten the usual mix of helpful advice and complete nonsense when someone with the username ExcelNinja47 posted a response that was basically a masterclass in personal finance disguised as a casual comment. She broke down exactly how to build an emergency fund when your income fluctuated, complete with formulas for calculating how much to save during good months to cover the lean ones. It was brilliant, practical, and written with the kind of dry humor that made complex math seem almost entertaining. I messaged her to say thanks and ask a follow-up question about tax implications for independent contractors. She messaged back with more detailed advice and a joke about how the tax code was apparently written by people who hated both math and the English language. We started talking. Lydia, it turned out, was a paralegal student putting herself through school while working at a law firm that specialized in small business law. She was maybe 26, had grown up in a family where financial stability was treated like a mythical creature, and had taught herself everything about money management through a combination of online courses, library books, and what she called aggressive trial and error. My mom always said I was too serious about money, she told me during one of our late-night message exchanges. She thought I should be out partying and spending my 20s being irresponsible. But I watched her struggle my whole childhood because she never learned how to make money work for her instead of against her. We talked about everything: budgeting strategies, investment basics, the psychological aspects of money management, and gradually, life in general. She had this way of making complex topics feel approachable, and more importantly, she never made me feel stupid for not knowing things that seemed obvious in retrospect. "You want to meet for coffee?" she asked after we'd been messaging for about 2 months. I mean, if you're not some kind of weird internet creeper. Though honestly, at this point I've seen your budget spreadsheets, so I probably know more about your life than your family does. We met at a quiet cafe downtown on a Saturday morning, and I spent the entire walk there convinced that she was either going to be nothing like her online personality or that I was going to say something spectacularly awkward and ruin everything. Instead, I found myself sitting across from someone with short black hair, kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses, and a smile that made me feel like maybe I wasn't as socially hopeless as I'd thought. "So," she said, stirring sugar into her coffee, "you're the guy who's been asking very responsible questions about emergency funds and then completely ignoring all the good advice about diversifying income streams." "Hey, I've been thinking about the income diversification thing," I protested. "It's just hard to figure out how to start." "That's because you're thinking about it wrong. You're not starting from zero. You've got construction skills, you understand project management, and you're learning business fundamentals. The question isn't how to start, it's how to leverage what you already know." We spent 3 hours at that cafe, talking about business models and market opportunities and the kind of dreams that seemed impossible but maybe weren't. She had this way of taking my half-formed ideas and turning them into actual plans, complete with timelines and benchmarks and realistic expectations about what success might look like. But more than that, she got it. She understood what it felt like to rebuild from nothing, to have people underestimate you, to wake up every day determined to prove that you were worth more than other people's low expectations. She'd grown up with a mother who treated financial planning like witchcraft and had spent her adult life proving that you could be both responsible and happy, both practical and ambitious. "You know what I like about you?" she said as we were walking to our cars. "You don't make excuses. Most people I meet want to complain about their problems. You actually want to solve them." With Diego teaching me about credit and investments, Mrs. Hill looking after my general well-being, and Lydia helping me think bigger about my future, I suddenly had something I hadn't realized I was missing: a support system. Not people who wanted something from me or who were just being polite, but actual friends who were invested in seeing me succeed. For the first time since walking away from Sabrina's social circle, I had people to call when something good happened, people to ask for advice when I was stuck, people who would tell me when I was being an idiot and celebrate when I figured something out. I had my people. And the best part? These were relationships I'd built myself, based on who I was becoming rather than who I used to be. Diego didn't know about the champagne towers or the birthday party humiliation. Mrs. Hill didn't care that I'd once been married to someone who thought I was a mistake. Lydia was interested in my plans for the future, not my drama from the past. They saw the man I was building, not the mess I'd walked away from. And slowly, I was starting to see him too. By year 4, I'd figured out something that probably should have been obvious, but somehow wasn't. Money isn't just about having it. It's about making it work for you instead of the other way around. It's like the difference between owning a dog and being owned by a dog. One scenario involves walks and belly rubs. The other involves your entire life revolving around someone else's bathroom schedule. Ralph had been dropping hints for months about expanding beyond just swinging hammers for other people. "You're good at this," he'd say while we were installing kitchen cabinets in someone else's investment property. "Got an eye for what needs doing and what's just pretty. Ever think about doing your own jobs?" The problem was that thinking about it and actually doing it were separated by a canyon of financial reality. Starting a construction business required tools, insurance, bonding, and enough cash flow to survive the gap between finishing work and getting paid. It was the classic catch-22. You need money to make money, but you need to make money to have money. That's when Ralph introduced me to Mr. Lewis, and suddenly my informal education in being a functional adult got a graduate-level upgrade. Arthur Lewis was maybe 75, built like a scarecrow, and had the kind of mind that could calculate compound interest in his head while discussing baseball scores. He'd been Ralph's accountant for 20 years and had apparently developed a soft spot for guys who were trying to build something from nothing. "So you want to start a business," he said during our first meeting, looking at me over reading glasses that had probably seen the rise and fall of several economic cycles. "What makes you think you won't screw it up like most people do?" It was a fair question. Most small businesses failed within the first year, usually because people confused having skills with knowing how to run a business. Being able to install plumbing and understanding cash flow were completely different skill sets. "Honestly, I don't know if I won't screw it up," I admitted. "But I figure if I'm going to fail, I'd rather fail trying to build something than succeed at staying exactly where I am." Mr. Lewis smiled at that, the kind of smile that suggested he'd heard similar statements from people who'd either become very successful or very bankrupt. "Good answer. Most people lie and tell me they've got it all figured out. Those are the ones who usually end up calling me crying about tax liens." He spent the next 2 hours explaining concepts that transformed how I thought about money. Compound interest wasn't just something that happened to other people's investments. It was a force that could work for or against you depending on whether you understood it. Credit wasn't just about being able to buy things you couldn't afford. It was about leveraging other people's money to build assets that generated income. "Here's what most people don't understand," Mr. Lewis said, drawing diagrams on a whiteboard that had probably been installed during the Carter administration. "Rich people don't work for money. They make money work for them. Poor people buy things that lose value. Middle-class people buy things they think are investments, but aren't. Rich people buy things that pay them." He introduced me to concepts I'd never heard of. LLCs and depreciation schedules, and the difference between active and passive income. He explained how real estate could generate tax advantages while building equity, how business expenses could reduce taxable income, and why timing mattered in almost every financial decision. Meanwhile, Lydia and I had turned financial planning into what she called our favorite nerdy hobby. We'd spend Saturday mornings at her apartment, spreading papers across her kitchen table and building spreadsheets that mapped out different scenarios for my future. What if I saved X amount per month? What if I started the business in 2 years versus 5? What if the construction market tanked and I needed a backup plan? "You know what I love about this?" she said during one of these sessions, gesturing at a particularly complex spreadsheet that tracked everything from projected income to potential tax liabilities. "We're not just planning. We're preparing for multiple possibilities." She was right. We weren't just building one plan. We were creating a framework that could adapt to different circumstances. If the construction business took off quickly, we had projections for scaling up. If it struggled, we had strategies for maintaining stability while pivoting. If the economy tanked entirely, we had contingency plans that didn't involve sleeping under bridges. But the real breakthrough came when Mr. Lewis started telling me stories about his other clients. Successful contractors who'd built empires from tool belts. real estate investors who'd started with nothing and retired at 50, small business owners who'd figured out how to make their money multiply while they slept. The secret, he said, isn't making a lot of money. It's keeping it, growing it, and making it work harder than you do. He taught me about the rule of 72, how compound interest could turn small, consistent investments into serious wealth over time. He showed me how to read financial statements, how to calculate return on investment, and most importantly, how to think strategically about money instead of just emotionally. The plan that emerged was simple but systematic. Keep living below my means, save aggressively, build credit strategically, and start positioning myself for opportunities. Not get-rich-quick schemes or lottery ticket investments, but boring, practical, proven strategies that compounded over time. By the end of year 5, I wasn't just surviving anymore. I was positioned. I had 6 months of expenses saved, a credit score that didn't make loan officers laugh, and enough financial knowledge to spot opportunities that my old self would have missed entirely. And speaking of opportunities, the whispers I'd been hearing through Diego's network suggested that Sabrina's picture-perfect lifestyle was developing some serious cracks. Maxed out credit cards, missed payments, the kind of financial stress that turned Instagram-worthy brunches into impossible luxuries. While she was learning what happened when the money ran out, I was learning how to make sure it never would again. The student was about to become the teacher. You know what they say about karma? That it's a bitch with a really twisted sense of timing and an appreciation for dramatic irony. Well, turns out karma also has excellent taste in real estate and a PhD in poetic justice, because the universe was about to serve up the most satisfying plot twist of my entire life. It started with a phone call from Diego on a Tuesday morning while I was elbow deep in a bathroom renovation that looked like it had been designed by someone who'd never actually seen a bathroom before. My phone buzzed with that particular urgency that usually meant either good news or complete disaster. And since my life had been running pretty smoothly lately, I was mentally prepared for disaster. "Dude, you need to hear this," Diego said without any preamble, his voice carrying that tone people use when they're about to share gossip, so good it should come with a warning label. "Please tell me you didn't accidentally demo a load-bearing wall again," I said, setting down my tile cutter and bracing myself for whatever construction catastrophe he was about to confess. "Nothing like that. This is about your ex-wife." That got my attention. I'd been so focused on building my new life that I'd almost managed to stop thinking about Sabrina entirely. Almost. She still lived in the back of my mind like a low-grade headache, a reminder of everything I was trying to prove wrong about myself. What about her? She's broke, man. Like, seriously broke. My cousin Rosa works at the property management company that handles her building, and apparently she's been getting eviction notices. Behind on rent for 3 months. I felt something twist in my chest. Not quite satisfaction, not quite pity, but something more complicated than either. How do you know this isn't just gossip? Because Rosa also mentioned that half the people in Sabrina's social circle are having money problems. Turns out living like Instagram influencers when you've got regular people jobs doesn't work out so well long-term. Who could have predicted that? The mental image was almost too perfect. All those women who'd laughed at me during the birthday party disaster, who'd acted like their designer handbags and bottomless brunch budgets made them superior beings, were apparently discovering that credit cards eventually demand payment, and that champagne taste on a beer budget is more philosophy than sustainable lifestyle. But here's the thing about revenge fantasies. They're way more satisfying in your imagination than they are in reality. Instead of feeling triumphant, I mostly just felt tired. These people had been living in a house of cards, and now the wind was blowing. It was predictable, inevitable, and ultimately kind of sad. "That's unfortunate," I said, trying to sound neutral even though part of me was doing mental victory laps. "Unfortunate? Dude, this is cosmic justice in action. These people treated you like garbage, and now they're finding out what happens when you spend money you don't have to impress people you don't like." Diego had a point, but I'd learned something in the years since walking away from that birthday party. Other people's failures didn't automatically make me successful. Their problems didn't solve mine. The best revenge wasn't watching them fall. It was making sure I never fell with them. Still, the timing was interesting, because that same week, everything in my own life started accelerating like someone had pressed fast forward on my carefully laid plans. Mr. Lewis called me into his office on Thursday with news that made me question whether I was living in some kind of elaborate simulation designed to test my ability to handle irony. A client of his, an investor who owns several rental properties, was looking to sell a duplex quickly due to what he diplomatically called liquidity needs and what normal people would call desperate to avoid bankruptcy. "It's not pretty," Mr. Lewis warned me, sliding a folder across his desk that contained photos of what could generously be called a project. "Needs major work, and I mean major. New roof, updated electrical, complete renovation of both units. But the price reflects the condition, and the location is solid." I opened the folder and immediately understood why the seller was motivated. The duplex looked like it had been used as a test site for every possible thing that could go wrong with the building. The roof sagged like it was tired of holding itself up. The front porch had developed a lean that suggested it was planning to become a ramp. The yard looked like it had been landscaped by someone who thought natural disaster chic was an actual design philosophy. But underneath all the problems, I could see the bones of something good. The structure was solid, the neighborhood was gentrifying, and with the right improvements, it could be a gold mine. More importantly, the numbers worked. Even factoring in renovation costs, carrying costs, and my own tendency toward pessimistic financial projections, the deal made sense. "I want it," I said before I'd fully processed what I was saying. Mr. Lewis smiled like he'd been expecting that response. "I was hoping you'd say that. Now let's talk about how to structure this so you don't end up house poor and stressed out of your mind." The next month was a blur of loan applications, inspections, and the kind of paperwork that makes you understand why some people just rent forever. Lydia practically moved into Mr. Lewis's office, helping me navigate the legal requirements and financial implications of becoming a property owner. She had this way of taking complex contracts and translating them into terms that didn't require a law degree to understand. "This is huge," she said during one of our late-night planning sessions, surrounded by mortgage documents and renovation estimates. "You're not just buying a house. You're buying an asset that will generate income while building equity. This is how people build wealth." She was right, but it was also terrifying. For the first time since leaving Sabrina, I was making a financial commitment that would affect my life for years. If I screwed this up, I wouldn't just lose money. I'd lose the foundation I'd been building for the past 5 years. But that's the thing about taking calculated risks. They're only risky if you haven't done your homework. Between Mr. Lewis's financial guidance, Lydia's legal insights, and my own hard-won construction knowledge, this wasn't a gamble. It was a strategic investment based on solid research and realistic projections. The closing was scheduled for a Friday afternoon in November, exactly 6 years after I'd walked out of Sabrina's birthday party with $20 and a backpack. I signed paper after paper, watched numbers move around on bank statements, and officially became a landlord. Walking through my duplex for the first time as the actual owner was surreal. Yes, it was a disaster. Yes, it was going to require months of work and every skill I'd learned from Ralph's crew. Yes, it was going to stretch my finances and my sanity in ways that would have terrified my old self. But it was mine, not something I was paying someone else for, not something that could be taken away from me with a well-timed insult or a change of heart. Mine. The contrast wasn't lost on me. While Sabrina was getting eviction notices and watching her social circle crumble under financial pressure, I was becoming the kind of person who other people signed contracts with. The man she'd called a family mistake was now someone who owned property, created rental agreements, and made decisions that affected other people's housing situations. I spent that first weekend walking through the duplex, taking measurements and making plans, thinking about the journey that had brought me here. From sleeping on bus station benches to owning rental property. From washing dishes for tips to building wealth through strategic investments. From being someone's mistake to being someone's landlord. It wasn't just success, it was the right kind of success. Built slowly, carefully, with help from good people and based on actual skills rather than luck or connections. The kind of success that couldn't be taken away with a joke or a mood swing. Ralph stopped by on Sunday to check out the property, walking through the rooms with the eye of someone who'd seen hundreds of renovation projects. "You know what this reminds me of?" he said, standing in what would eventually be a decent kitchen once I replaced everything in it. "A natural disaster? You. When I first met you, you were a mess. But underneath all the problems, there were good bones. Took some work to bring them out, but the foundation was solid. He clapped me on the shoulder. Same thing here. This place is good bones. Just needs someone who knows how to fix what's broken. As he drove away, I stood on the front porch of my disaster of a duplex, watching the sun set over a neighborhood that was slowly transforming from rough to respectable. I thought about Sabrina, probably sitting in her apartment wondering how her perfect life had gone so wrong. I thought about all the people who'd laughed at her joke about me being a mistake. They'd been right about one thing. I was definitely not the person I was supposed to be. But that turned out to be the best mistake I'd ever made. 6 years. 6 years since I'd walked out of that birthday party with nothing but wounded pride in a backpack full of basic necessities. 6 years since I'd heard Sabrina's voice, seen her face, or given a damn about what she was doing with her life. I'd moved on so completely that she'd become more like a character from a book I'd read once than an actual person who'd shared my bed and bank account. So when the doorbell rang on that rainy Tuesday afternoon in March, the last person I expected to see on my security camera was the woman who'd once called me a family mistake in front of half the city's social climbing population. But there she was, standing under my porch light like some kind of bedraggled ghost from my past, looking nothing like the queen bee who'd held court at rooftop restaurants and champagne towers. The Sabrina I remembered had been all sharp edges and designer confidence, the kind of woman who could make a waiter feel inadequate just by ordering water. This woman looked like she'd been through a wood chipper and hadn't quite been reassembled correctly. Her hair, which used to be professionally styled twice a week and treated like a religious artifact, hung limp and dull around her shoulders. The makeup that had once been applied with the precision of a Renaissance master was streaked and running, creating abstract art across cheekbones that looked sharper than I remembered, not from contouring, but from the kind of weight loss that comes from stress and skipped meals. The designer handbag that had once been her most prized possession, the one she'd saved for 3 months to buy and treated like it was made of solid gold, was nowhere to be seen. Instead, she clutched a worn leather purse that looked like it had been purchased at a discount store during a fire sale. Her clothes, while clean, had that slightly too big look that suggested they'd been bought when she could afford better sizes or borrowed from someone else entirely. But it was her eyes that really told the story. The confidence, the entitlement, the casual cruelty that had once sparkled behind her perfectly applied mascara. All of it was gone, replaced by something desperate and hollow and completely foreign to the woman I'd once been married to. She pressed the doorbell again, then again, with the kind of insistence that suggested she knew I was home and wasn't planning to leave until I answered. Through the security camera's audio, I could hear her calling my name like she'd been practicing the words, like she'd rehearsed this moment in her head 100 times. "Please," she said to the camera, looking directly into the lens with eyes that were red-rimmed and desperate. "I know you're there. I just need to talk. 5 minutes. That's all I'm asking." The smart thing. The thing that 6 years of hard-won wisdom and emotional distance should have dictated, would have been to ignore her. To let her stand there in the rain until she gave up and went away, back to whatever life she'd built from the wreckage of her poor financial decisions. The woman who'd publicly humiliated me didn't deserve 5 minutes of my time, much less whatever favor she'd clearly come to ask. But here's the thing about human nature. Sometimes the smart thing and the satisfying thing are completely different. And after 6 years of wondering what it would feel like to have her need something from me, I found myself curious enough to want to hear what desperation sounded like in her voice. I didn't answer the door. Not yet. Instead, I stood there watching her through the camera, studying this strange, diminished version of someone who'd once loomed so large in my life. She kept pressing the buzzer, kept calling my name, kept promising she just needed a few minutes to explain something important. After maybe 10 minutes of this performance, she finally stopped ringing the bell and pulled out a piece of paper, the kind of notebook paper that suggested she couldn't afford proper stationery anymore. She wrote something quickly, folded it up, and slid it under my door like some kind of desperate love note from a teenager. I waited until I heard her footsteps retreating down the porch steps before I picked up the note. Her handwriting, which had once been careful and precise, the kind of penmanship that came from private school and a mother who cared about such things, was now shaky and rushed. "Please, I need to talk. I was wrong about everything. I know you probably hate me, and you have every right to, but I'm in trouble and I don't know who else to turn to. I'll be at Murphy's Coffee tomorrow at 2 p.m. if you'll meet me. If not, I understand. I read the note 3 times, not because the words were complicated, but because I was trying to process the sheer audacity of it all. The woman who'd made me into a punchline, who'd treated our marriage like an inconvenient obstacle to her social aspirations, who'd called me a mistake in front of everyone who mattered to her. That woman was now asking me for help. The old me, the guy who'd been so desperate for her approval that he'd bankrupt himself trying to make her happy, might have felt sorry for her. Might have seen this as an opportunity for reconciliation or closure or whatever psychological buzzword applied to former spouses meeting for coffee. But the new me, the guy who'd built a life from nothing, who owned property and had real friends and had learned the difference between being needed and being used, felt something entirely different. I felt powerful. For the first time in our entire relationship, Sabrina needed something from me more than I needed anything from her. My hands were shaking as I held the note, but not from fear or anxiety. It was the electric charge of long-awaited vindication, the physical manifestation of justice finally showing up fashionably late to the party. The woman who dismissed me as a mistake was now begging for 5 minutes of my time. I could ignore her. I could let her sit at Murphy's Coffee tomorrow, checking her phone every 30 seconds and wondering if I was going to show up. I could let her experience what it felt like to wait for someone who might not think you're worth their time. God knows she'd put me in that position often enough during our marriage. But ignoring her would mean missing the opportunity I'd been unconsciously preparing for since the night I walked out of her birthday party. This wasn't just about her needing help. This was about her finally understanding the true cost of treating people like disposable accessories. I walked to my desk, pulled out a piece of actual letterhead, the kind with my business name and contact information printed in professional fonts, and wrote a simple response. Murphy's Coffee, tomorrow, 2 p.m. Come alone. I didn't sign it. She'd know who it was from. The next 24 hours crawled by like they were being personally supervised by someone who hated the concept of time. I went through the motions of work, of normal life, of pretending I wasn't thinking about what Sabrina might want or how this conversation was going to play out. But every few minutes, my mind would drift back to that image of her on my security camera, desperate, diminished, and finally forced to confront the reality that actions have consequences. I arrived at Murphy's 15 minutes early, not because I was eager, but because I wanted to watch her walk in. I wanted to see her scan the room looking for me. Wanted to observe her body language when she realized she was about to have the most important conversation of her recent life with someone she'd written off as irrelevant. I chose a corner table with a clear view of the entrance and ordered black coffee, not because I needed the caffeine, but because I wanted to look settled and comfortable when she arrived, like someone who belonged here, who had every right to be exactly where he was. At exactly 2:03 p.m., she walked through the door. If seeing her on the security camera had been shocking, seeing her in person was devastating. The woman who'd once commanded attention just by walking into a room now looked like she was trying to make herself invisible. She moved carefully, hesitantly, like someone who wasn't sure she had permission to exist in spaces where other people seemed confident and comfortable. She spotted me almost immediately, probably because I was the only person in the coffee shop who was staring at the entrance like a hawk watching for prey. For a moment, we just looked at each other across the room. Two people who'd once shared everything and now had absolutely nothing in common except a history we'd both probably prefer to forget. Then she walked over to my table, moving with the careful deliberation of someone who knew they were walking into a conversation that could change everything. "Thank you for coming," she said, sliding into the chair across from me like she was afraid it might disappear if she moved too quickly. "I wasn't sure you would." "I almost didn't," I replied, which was true but also calculated to remind her that her presence here was a privilege, not a right. She nodded like she understood, like she'd expected exactly that response. "I know I don't have any right to ask you for anything. I know what I did was unforgivable. But I'm in trouble, and you're the only person I know who might be able to help." The only person she knew who might be able to help. Not the only person she trusted, or the only person she felt comfortable asking. The only person who might actually have the resources to make a difference in whatever disaster her life had become. It was exactly the kind of brutal honesty that our marriage had been missing for years. "I'm not going to do this here," I said, cutting her off before she could launch into whatever sob story she'd rehearsed during her sleepless nights. If you want to have this conversation, we're going to do it properly. Sabrina blinked, clearly thrown off her script. She'd probably imagined this going differently. Maybe me jumping up to comfort her, or at least showing some sign that I still cared about her problems. Instead, she was getting the business version of me, the one who'd learned that emotional manipulation only works if you let it. What do you mean? I mean, if we're going to talk about whatever mess you've gotten yourself into, we're going to do it with witnesses. People who were there for the beginning of this story. I pulled out my phone and started typing. Tomorrow night, 7 p.m., Giovanni's on 5th Street. Private dining room. You, me, and some friends. The look on her face was priceless. Confusion mixed with panic and just a touch of the old entitlement. Friends? What friends? I thought we were going to talk privately. Nothing between us is private anymore, Sabrina. You made sure of that 6 years ago when you turned our marriage into a punchline for your social media followers. I stood up, leaving my barely touched coffee on the table. Tomorrow night. Don't be late. I walked out before she could respond, leaving her sitting there in Murphy's coffee looking like someone who'd just realized the game had changed and she didn't know the new rules. The next 24 hours were spent in preparation mode. I called Lydia first, explaining the situation and asking if she'd be willing to attend what I was already thinking of as the reckoning. Then Ralph, who listened to my plan and chuckled like he'd been waiting years for this moment. Finally, Mr. Lewis, who agreed to come with the kind of enthusiasm usually reserved for people heading to particularly entertaining sporting events. Giovanni's private dining room was perfect for what I had in mind. Intimate enough to feel personal, but formal enough to make it clear this wasn't a casual reunion. I arrived 15 minutes early with my support team, arranging the seating so that Sabrina would be facing all of us across a table that suddenly felt very much like a boardroom. When she walked in at exactly 7 p.m., I almost felt sorry for her. Almost. She'd clearly tried to put herself together for this meeting. Clean clothes, fresh makeup, hair that looked like she'd actually brushed it. But there's only so much you can do to disguise desperation, and it was written all over her face. You brought an audience, she said, her voice carrying a note of the old sarcasm that used to cut so deep. I brought witnesses, I corrected. Lydia, my business partner. Ralph, my mentor. Mr. Lewis, my accountant. The people who helped me rebuild after you decided I was disposable. I watched her face as the implications sank in. Business partner, mentor, accountant. These weren't just titles. They were proof of a life she'd never imagined I was capable of building. Please, sit down, I said, gesturing to the chair we'd left open for her. I understand you have a business proposition for us. She sat carefully, like she was afraid the chair might collapse under the weight of her problems. It's not a business proposition. I need help. I'm behind on everything. Rent, credit cards, car payments. I'm about to lose my apartment. I slid a folder across the table, the kind of professional presentation that Mr. Lewis had taught me to prepare for important meetings. Before we discuss what you need, let's review what I've built since you called me a family mistake. Her hands trembled as she opened the folder. Inside were copies of property deeds, bank statements, business registrations, the documented proof of everything I'd accomplished in the years since walking away from her birthday party disaster. 2 rental properties, fully renovated and generating positive cash flow, I said as she flipped through the pages. A construction consulting business with steady clients. Investment accounts that have been growing consistently for 4 years. Everything you're looking at was built from the $20 I had in my wallet the night I left. Sabrina looked up from the papers, and for the first time since she'd appeared on my doorstep, I saw something other than desperation in her eyes. I saw recognition, maybe even respect. How? She asked quietly. Hard work, good advice, and friends who saw potential instead of problems. I gestured around the table. The same friends who are here tonight to make sure I don't make any decisions I'll regret. So you'll help me? That depends, Lydia said, speaking for the first time since Sabrina had arrived, on whether you're ready to acknowledge what you did and take responsibility for where you are now. The silence that followed was heavy with 6 years of unspoken truths. Sabrina looked around the table, at the faces of people who'd never met her but had heard every detail of how she'd treated me. People who had no reason to like her and every reason to protect me from making the same mistakes twice. I called you a mistake, she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. In front of everyone. I treated you like you were worthless, like your only purpose was to pay for my lifestyle. I was cruel and selfish and wrong. It was the apology I'd imagined hearing 1,000 times, but actually hearing it felt strangely anticlimactic. The words couldn't undo 6 years of rebuilding myself from nothing. They couldn't erase the nights I'd slept under bridges or the months I'd lived on leftover diner food, but they could determine what happened next. If I help you, I said, it won't be because I forgive you. It won't be because I think you deserve it. It'll be because I'm not the same person you married, and the person I've become doesn't leave people drowning when he has the ability to help. I pulled out a single sheet of paper, a contract I drafted with Mr. Lewis's help. These are my terms. Non-negotiable. She read it twice, her face cycling through emotions I couldn't quite identify. Accountability, she said finally. Public accountability. To everyone who was there that night. Everyone who laughed when you called me a mistake. You tell them the truth about what happened and who I really am now. She looked up at me, and for the first time in our entire relationship, I saw something I'd never seen before. Fear. Not of losing her apartment or maxing out her credit cards, but of losing the last shred of the identity she'd built on other people's backs. And if I don't, then you leave here the same way you came, alone, broke, and running out of options. She left Giovanni's that night looking like someone who'd been asked to solve quantum physics while blindfolded and riding a unicycle. The contract sat on the table between us for a full 5 minutes while she stared at it like it might transform into something more palatable if she concentrated hard enough. Finally, she folded it up, slipped it into that sad discount store purse, and walked out without saying another word. I didn't expect to hear from her again. Hell, part of me hoped I wouldn't. The whole evening had felt like closure, not the warm, fuzzy kind where everyone hugs and learns valuable lessons about forgiveness, but the cold, practical kind where accounts get settled and debts get acknowledged. But Sabrina, apparently, wasn't quite ready to accept that her consequences had finally caught up with her. The texts started 3 days later. At first, they were attempts at negotiation. Could she make the apology private instead of public? Could she apologize to some people, but not others? Could she maybe just post something vague on social media and call it even? Each message was more desperate than the last, like someone trying to haggle with gravity or negotiate with mathematics. I didn't respond to any of them. The voicemails came next. Long, rambling messages where she tried to explain why public accountability was unfair and humiliating and would destroy what's left of my reputation. She wanted me to understand that she was already suffering enough and that forcing her to admit her mistakes publicly was cruel and vindictive. I deleted those without listening to them all the way through. The letters were the final stage of her denial process. Handwritten notes delivered to my office, my apartment, even sent to Ralph's construction company. Pages of justification and excuses and appeals to whatever mercy she imagined I might still harbor. She reminded me of the good times we'd had, promised she'd learned her lesson, swore she'd never treat anyone the way she'd treated me. But none of those letters contained the one thing that might have changed my mind: genuine understanding of why accountability mattered. She still saw my terms as punishment rather than opportunity, as something being done to her rather than something she could choose to do for herself. Meanwhile, my life continued moving forward with the kind of steady momentum that comes from good decisions compounding over time. The duplex renovation was ahead of schedule and under budget. My consulting business had picked up 3 new clients through word-of-mouth referrals. Lydia and I had started talking about partnerships that went beyond spreadsheets and business plans. "You know what I admire about you," she said one evening as we walked through my latest property acquisition. A small commercial building that would soon house a coffee shop and 2 retail spaces. "You don't hold grudges. You hold standards." She was right, though I hadn't thought about it in those terms. I wasn't angry at Sabrina anymore. Anger was too expensive an emotion to maintain long-term. I was simply clear about what behavior I was willing to accept and what I wasn't. 3 months passed without any communication from Sabrina. I assumed she'd finally accepted that her only options were my terms or no help at all, and had chosen to handle her problems some other way. Maybe she'd found another source of rescue, or learned to live with less, or figured out how to dig herself out of debt through actual work instead of emotional manipulation. Then Diego called with news that explained the silence. "She's gone, man," he said, his voice carrying that tone people use when they're not sure if they're delivering good news or bad news. My cousin Rosa says she moved out of the apartment in the middle of the night. Left town, apparently. Didn't tell anyone where she was going. So that was it then. Sabrina had chosen exile over accountability, running away to somewhere she could start fresh without having to explain why her old life had fallen apart. It was probably the smart choice, practically speaking. Easier to reinvent yourself in a new city than to face the consequences of your mistakes in the old one. I should have felt victorious. The woman who'd called me a mistake had been forced to rebuild her entire life, just like I'd been forced to rebuild mine. Karma had finally balanced the books, and justice had been served with interest compounded over 6 years. Instead, I felt something I hadn't expected: peace. Not because she was gone, but because I finally understood that her approval or disapproval, her presence or absence, her success or failure had absolutely no bearing on my worth as a human being. The man who'd walked out of her birthday party had been desperate for validation from people who didn't deserve to judge him. The man I'd become didn't need validation from anyone except the person he saw in the mirror each morning. Lydia found me that evening on the back porch of my first duplex, watching the sunset over a neighborhood that had quietly transformed from rough to respectable while I wasn't paying attention. "You heard," she said, settling into the chair beside me with 2 bottles of beer and the kind of comfortable silence that comes from understanding someone completely. "I heard. Any regrets?" I thought about it seriously, because Lydia deserved serious answers to serious questions. Did I regret not compromising on my terms? Not accepting a half-hearted apology that would have let Sabrina save face while getting the help she needed? Not choosing reconciliation over accountability? "No," I said finally. She made her choice the same way I made mine. I chose to rebuild myself into someone stronger. She chose to run away rather than face what she'd done. Both choices have consequences. And if she comes back someday, if she shows up ready to meet your terms, then we'll see who she's become and whether it's someone worth helping. I took a long drink of beer and watched a young family walking down the street, the parents pushing a stroller while their toddler rode a bicycle with training wheels. But I'm not holding my breath. The next morning, I woke up in my own bed, in my own house, surrounded by the life I'd built with my own hands and the help of people who'd seen my potential instead of my problems. I had properties that generated income while I slept, friends who celebrated my successes without jealousy, and a woman who loved the person I'd become instead of tolerating the person I used to be. Sabrina had called me a family mistake 6 years ago. She'd been wrong about the family part. These people, this life I'd built, this was my real family. But the mistake part? She'd been absolutely right. Marrying her had been a mistake. Trying to buy her love with money I didn't have had been a mistake. Accepting her version of who I was supposed to be had been the biggest mistake of all. But walking away from her birthday party that night? That had been the best decision I'd ever made. Sometimes the most important moment in your life looks like giving up. Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is admit you're in the wrong place with the wrong people living the wrong life. Sometimes being called a mistake is exactly the wake-up call you need to stop making them. When people ask me now if I regret leaving that night, I tell them the truth. I regret that it took me so long to realize I deserved better, but I'll never regret choosing to become someone worthy of better treatment. The books, as they say, are finally balanced.